The sun hung low over Redemption Ridge, painting the world in shades of dust and sorrow. The wind carried the scent of dry sagebrush and memories long buried, whispering through the abandoned fences of Caleb Ward's ranch. Once, this land had been alive with laughter, the neigh of horses, the sound of a woman's voice calling supper, the tiny footsteps of a child running to greet her father. But those echoes had died long ago, leaving only the creak of the windmill and the rasp of a man who had forgotten what it meant to smile. Caleb was a tall man, broad-shouldered and stoic, with eyes the color of rainless clouds. The townsfolk called him the lonely cowboy. Some pitied him, others feared him, and a few whispered that he'd gone half mad from grief. But Caleb didn't care for what people thought. His world began and ended with his ranch, the only thing he still knew how to tend. Even as the crops withered and his faith in living did the same God every morning. He rose before dawn, pulling on his worn boots and faded hat, and rode out across the brittle land. His horse, Jasper, was his only companion, and even the old gelding seemed to carry the same quiet sadness. Caleb worked until sunset, mending fences that would break again, patching roofs that would still leak when it rained, if it ever rained. It was a rhythm without purpose, a life without expectation. He wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not until she came. Miles away, Evelyn Ross sat on the back of a wagon heading west, clutching a small leather bag that contained everything she owned. Her gloved hands trembled as the horses trudged through the barren road, wheels kicking up golden dust that clung to her skirts. She was a widow of 2 years, still young but hollowed by sorrow. Her husband's death had left her not only alone but childless, her dream of motherhood buried with him. The doctors in Kansas had called it God's will, but Evelyn couldn't accept that. Somewhere deep down, she still believed that miracles happened to those who refused to stop hoping. She had sold what little she had to travel west, lured by stories of open land and new beginnings. But more than a home, she sought peace, a place where she could stop pretending she was whole. Her wagon driver, a grizzled old man named Henry, had warned her that the land was hard and unforgiving, but Evelyn smiled softly and said, "So am I?" By the time the storm clouds gathered that evening, she was miles from the nearest town. Thunder rolled across the plains, and the horses grew restless. Rain came down in fierce, slanting sheets, soaking through her coat and bonnet. The wagon lurched and creaked as the wheels sank into the mud. When one of them splintered, the wagon tipped violently, throwing Evelyn into the wet earth. She tried to stand, but pain shot through her ankle. Henry shouted over the rain, trying to fix the damage, but lightning split the sky, spooking the horses. They bolted, dragging the wagon half a mile before crashing near a lonely ranch fence, the fence that marked Caleb Ward's land. Evelyn lay there shivering, soaked and frightened, staring up at the shadow of a man on horseback riding through the rain toward her. He dismounted without a word, lifting her gently in his arms. His coat was rough against her skin, his jaw unshaven, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "Easy now," he murmured, voice low as thunder. "You're safe here, ma'am." For the first time in years, Evelyn felt something flicker inside her, something that almost felt like trust. And for Caleb, the moment his eyes met hers, the emptiness of the land seemed to shift. He didn't know it yet, but the miracle he'd stopped believing in had just arrived on his doorstep. The storm raged well into the night, drumming against the tin roof of Caleb Ward's barn like 1,000 restless hands. Inside, the scent of hay and rain filled the air. Evelyn sat on a wooden crate, her wet dress clinging to her skin, her ankle bound in a strip of torn linen. The barn lantern cast a warm glow over her pale face, softening the fear in her eyes. Caleb stood a few feet away, silent as ever, tending to the horses with the care of a man who'd learned to love creatures more than people. His movements were steady, deliberate feeding, brushing, checking hooves, anything to keep his hands busy and his heart still. Yet every few moments his gaze flicked toward the woman sitting in his barn, like he couldn't help himself. Evelyn had tried to thank him, but her voice trembled too much. Instead, she watched him quietly, the way one might watch a wild animal up close, careful not to startle him. He was not handsome in the polished way of city men, but something about him drew her in. The rugged lines of his face, the set of his shoulders, the silence that seemed to weigh on him like armor. When he finally spoke, it startled her. "You shouldn't be out here alone. The plains don't take kindly to wanderers." His voice was deep and rough, but not unkind. "I wasn't wandering," she replied softly, her hands folded in her lap. "I was searching for something." Caleb gave a small grunt, half amusement, half disbelief. "And you think you'll find it in Redemption Ridge?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I had to try." For a while, only the wind spoke between them. Caleb poured her a cup of coffee from the pot warming by the stove and handed it to her without meeting her eyes. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the tin mug, grateful for the heat seeping into her fingers. He finally asked, "You got family here?" "No," she said. "No one left." The way she said it quietly, without tears, struck something in him. Caleb knew the sound of loss when he heard it. He'd spoken it himself once, until words became too painful to use. He nodded toward the corner. "There's a cot over there. You can stay till the storm passes." She hesitated. "I don't want to trouble you." "You already are," he said dryly, then softened it with a small tilt of his mouth. "But I reckon I don't mind." That almost smile, brief and crooked, made Evelyn's heart stir unexpectedly. She looked down quickly, pretending to sip her coffee. Outside, the wind began to calm, though the night was still heavy with rain. The rhythm of it became oddly soothing. Evelyn lay on the cot later, staring up at the rafters, listening to the slow steps of Caleb pacing the barn. She could tell he wasn't a man used to company. There was a gentleness in his quiet, like he'd forgotten how to speak to another soul and was trying to remember. When she drifted to sleep, she dreamed of laughter, hers and a man's, echoing through the open prairie. Caleb stood near the doorway, watching her for a long time. There was something about the sight of her, small, fragile, yet unbroken, that unsettled him. The storm outside mirrored the one within him. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "Don't start hoping, Ward. She'll be gone by sunrise." But deep down, he already knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted the moment he found her. The wind no longer sounded so lonely. The night didn't feel so endless, and though neither of them understood it yet, this chance encounter in the storm would change both their lives forever. Morning came soft and golden, spilling through the cracks of the barn like threads of hope. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings, a scent that stirred. Something faint but undeniable in both. Caleb and Evelyn. Evelyn awoke to the distant sound of a paleta, rooster crowing, and the creak of the barn door. Caleb was already up, tending to the horses. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his forearms dusted with hay, and the strand of hair had fallen across his brow. He looked younger in the light, less haunted somehow. When he noticed her awake, he tipped his hat. "Mornin'. You sleep all right?" Evelyn sat up slowly, her ankle still sore but not unbearable. "Better than I expected. Thank you for last night." He shrugged, as though kindness were just part of his routine. "Wasn't nothin'. You can't leave yet. Roads'll be mud clear to town." She smiled faintly. "Seems I'm your guest a little longer then." Caleb didn't answer. He just handed her a plate of cornbread and beans, simple but warm. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The quiet between them felt almost peaceful, like the world had forgotten to rush. After breakfast, Evelyn limped outside to breathe in the morning air. The ranch stretched endlessly before her, wild and beautiful in its loneliness. Fences in need of repair bordered fields that had once thrived. A windmill turned lazily in the distance. She felt a strange ache in her chest and urged to see it alive again, to bring something back to this forgotten place. Caleb joined her after a moment, following her gaze. "This land used to be something," he said quietly. "My pa built it with his bare hands. My wife and I tried to keep it going after he passed." Evelyn turned toward him, surprised by the softness in his tone. "You had a wife?" He nodded once, jaw tightening. "And a little girl." Fever took 'em both. "Long time ago." The silence that followed was heavy. Evelyn didn't know what to say, only that her heart hurt for him. Loss recognized loss. It was a kind of language all its own. Finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry. I know words can't fix that. But sometimes it helps to talk about what's gone." Caleb gave a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I've done enough talking to ghosts." He paused, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You travelin' west alone, what were you looking for?" Her eyes fell to the ground. "A reason to keep believing," she said softly. "I prayed for a child for years, but God never answered. My husband died before we could try again. I thought maybe if I went somewhere new, he might finally hear me." Caleb's chest tightened. There was no mockery in her words, just raw, aching hope. He wasn't a praying man anymore, but the way she spoke made him wish he still was. He cleared his throat. "Maybe the Lord's just waiting to surprise you." She smiled sadly. "Do you believe that?" He hesitated, then surprised himself by saying, "Maybe I do." And then, with a voice rough and unsure, he added, "Tell you what, Mrs. Ross, you stay here till you're strong enough to move on, and I'll see to it you get your miracle." Her brows lifted slightly. "My miracle?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Could be a new start. Could be something you don't see coming. Either way, I'll find it for you." Evelyn's eyes glistened in the morning light. She didn't know why she believed him, but she did. For Caleb, the promise wasn't just words. It was the first spark of purpose he'd felt in years. And though he didn't yet understand what kind of miracle he'd just promised, somewhere deep inside, hope, quiet and unfamiliar, began to stir again. The days after the storm unfolded slowly, with a kind of quiet that felt more alive than silence. The earth began to dry beneath the sun, and Evelyn's ankle, though tender, grew stronger. She helped where she could, mending torn sacks, washing tin plates, brushing the horses. Caleb tried to protest at first, insisting she rest, but she only smiled and said, "If I sit too long, I start thinking too much." He understood that. So he let her help. The ranch began to hum again, faintly, like an old song remembered. Evelyn's laughter, soft and unforced, filled the barn as she scolded Jasper for stealing oats, and Caleb found himself listening for that sound without meaning to. Each day she seemed to bring light into corners that had long forgotten what it felt like. One morning, while she hung linens in the wind, Caleb watched from the porch. The sunlight caught her hair, turning it into gold against the pale sky. For a moment, he could almost see his ranch the way he's used to be, alive, hopeful, whole. But the memory of his late wife, Clara, slipped in like a shadow, reminding him how fragile that hope could be. He turned away, jaw tightening. He wouldn't let himself fall into that trap again. That evening, Evelyn approached him with an idea. "You've got a fine piece of land here, Mr. Ward," she began, "but it's tired. It needs hands and care. Let me help you bring it back." Caleb frowned, setting down his hammer. "You already are helping. You don't owe me more." "I'm not talking about debt," she said, voice steady. "I'm talking about purpose. You need this ranch to live again, and maybe I need that too." He studied her face. She wasn't a woman asking for pity or charity. She was offering partnership, strength, maybe even belonging. Still, his instinct was to protect what little he had left of himself. "I ain't much good at working with folks," he said finally. "Never ends well. Then maybe this time will be different." Her eyes met his, and something in him faltered. He'd built walls around his heart brick by brick, but she had found a way to slip between the cracks without trying. He sighed, rubbing a hand across his neck. "All right. You can stay on. Help with what needs doing. But if the gossiping hens in town start flapping their tongues, don't say I didn't warn you." Evelyn smiled a smile that felt like sunlight after a long winter. "Let them talk. Folks always do. I've weathered worse than whispers." And so it began. Their days found rhythm. Together, they rebuilt fences, cleared dead brush, and patched the roof. Caleb taught her to saddle Jasper and ride across the open range. She laughed each time she lost balance and he caught her by the waist. His calloused hands lingering a second too long dot at night, they shared supper by the fire beans, cornbread, and quiet conversation. She told stories about her late husband, about the life she thought she'd live. Caleb listened more than he spoke, but sometimes his eyes softened when she spoke of loss. Slowly the air between them thickened, not with awkwardness, but with something neither dared name. One evening, as dusk bled across the sky, Evelyn leaned on the porch rail and said, "You know, Mr. Ward, maybe this is the miracle you promised me. A home. A reason to keep going." Caleb stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Maybe," he murmured, "but you best be careful. Miracles got a habit of breaking hearts if you hold them too close." She turned to him, eyes glinting with quiet resolve. "Then maybe it's time we both stop being afraid to hope." The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of sage and something sweeter. Neither spoke again, but they didn't need to. Somewhere in the silence, an unspoken deal had been made not just of work or survival, but of hearts daring, once again, to believe. By the time autumn brushed across Redemption Ridge, the ranch had begun to change. What was once dry and forgotten now breathed again. The fences stood firm, the horses grew strong, and the fields whispered with the promise of life. Caleb often caught himself wondering how he had managed it all those years alone and realizing now. It wasn't just him anymore. Evelyn had a hand in everything, feeding the stock before sunrise, sewing patches into worn saddle blankets, even bargaining with traders who came through town. Her gentle determination softened the harsh edges of the place and of Caleb himself. He found himself speaking more, even laughing sometimes, though he tried to hide it behind his hat brim. But beneath that growing comfort, both carried ghosts. And one cold evening, those ghosts came knocking. It began with a letter. The town's postboy brought it out on horseback, crumpled, weathered, bearing Caleb's name. He stared at it for a long time before opening it, the sight of the handwriting tightening his chest. It was from Margaret Hawley, his late wife's sister. He hadn't heard from her in years, not since Clara and their daughter, Lucy, had died. The letter was polite but sharp, reminding him that the past wasn't something he could just bury under work and silence. Margaret had written that Clara's grave was being moved due to new land boundaries back east. "You should come say your farewell properly," she wrote. "It's been too long, Caleb." That night, Evelyn found him sitting alone on the porch, the letter folded in his fist. The light from the lantern flickered across his face, revealing the storm behind his calm. "You all right?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "Some things just don't fade, no matter how far you ride." She sat beside him, waiting. He finally said, "My wife and little girl, they're buried in Missouri. Haven't been back since. Thought I could keep moving forward by not looking back." Guess I was wrong. Evelyn reached for his hand, but he didn't take it. He stared into the dark fields instead. I told myself I was protecting their memory. Truth is, I was just running from it. She hesitated, then spoke gently. Maybe running was the only way you knew how to survive. But Caleb, the past isn't meant to chain us. It's meant to teach us how to live again. He glanced at her then, really looked at her, and for a heartbeat. The weight in his eyes seemed to ease. I ain't sure I remember how, he murmured. You're remembering, she said with a faint smile. Every time you choose to live instead of mourn. The next morning, while cleaning the study, Evelyn stumbled upon an old wooden box half buried beneath papers. Inside lay a faded photograph, a woman with kind eyes holding a little girl with curls and a missing front tooth. Evelyn's breath caught. This was them, Clara and Lucy, the same faces that haunted Caleb's silence. When he found her holding it, his reaction was swift, a flicker of anger and pain. You shouldn't go through my things. I wasn't prying, she said softly, setting the photograph down. I was remembering with you. Her calmness disarmed him. For the first time, someone hadn't looked at his pain with pity, but with understanding. Still that night, the whispers began. The townsfolk had seen her coming and going from the ranch, her laughter mingling with his. At the general store, tongues wagged. The widow and the cowboy, they said. Living alone under one roof shameful, no matter the reason. When Caleb went into town for supplies, he heard them too. And though he tried to ignore it, the words clawed at his conscience. He'd sworn to protect Evelyn, not ruin her name. That night, as the fire crackled between them, he finally said, Maybe it's best if you move into town for a while. Folks are starting to talk. Evelyn looked at him, eyes steady but wounded. And let M win? Let their words decide our lives? He couldn't answer. He wanted to tell her that he cared, that maybe he was beginning to feel something dangerous and real. But all he said was, I don't want you hurt on account of me. She stood, her voice low but fierce. Caleb Ward, you promised me a miracle. Maybe it's time you start believing you deserve one too. Then she turned away, leaving him staring into the fire, torn between fear and the flickering warmth of a love he'd never expected to find again. The whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew sharper like thorns hidden beneath polite smiles. When Evelyn rode into town for flour or medicine, conversations paused. Women tilted their heads, whispering behind gloved hands, while men offered knowing smirks. Redemption Ridge had always been small, but gossip traveled faster than any horse. Caleb saw it happening and hated himself for being the cause. He'd built his life on silence, but now every glance and murmur seemed to echo the one thing he feared most, that his heart had betrayed his past. He tried to keep distance between them. He took his meals early, spent longer hours out on the range, and spoke little when they crossed paths. Evelyn noticed, of course. She wasn't a woman easily fooled. His avoidance cut deeper than any town rumor ever could. One evening, she finally asked, Why are you treating me like a stranger again, Caleb? He was repairing a fence post, the hammer steady in his hand. Ain't treating you no way. Just busy is all. Busy? She said, her voice trembling. Or running scared. The hammer struck the wood harder than necessary. You think you know me that well? I know when someone's building a wall, same as I know when someone's already trapped behind one, she said quietly. You ain't protecting me, Caleb. You're protecting yourself from feeling again. Her words hit like a clean shot to the heart. But before he could answer, a shout echoed across the field. Ward! You best come out here. It was Sheriff Donnelly, riding fast, followed by Earl Tompkins, a neighboring rancher with a face red from anger. Caleb's gut sank. He wiped his hands and walked toward them. Earl swung down from his horse, waving a paper. Got myself proof you been rustlin' my cattle, Ward. Found your brand burned over mine on 3 head of stock. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's a damn lie. The sheriff raised a hand. Easy now. We'll sort this proper. But he's got witnesses. Evelyn came to stand beside Caleb, her dress whipping in the wind. Sheriff, you know Caleb wouldn't steal from no one. He's worked day and night just to keep his own herd alive. Earl sneered. Funny how the widow's the one speaking for him. Maybe you don't know him as well as you think. The insult burned hotter than the accusation. Caleb stepped forward, fists clenched. You keep her name out of your mouth, Tompkins, or what? Earl taunted. You'll hit me, same as you cheated me? Before it could go further, the sheriff stepped between them. That's enough. We'll investigate. But Caleb, till we clear this up, I need you to stay close to the ranch. When they rode off, dust curling behind them, Evelyn turned to him, her voice shaking. You can't let this stand. You're innocent. Caleb stared after the sheriff's horse, his shoulders heavy. Innocent don't mean much when the town's already decided. Then fight, she said fiercely. You fought for me when the storm near took my life. Why won't you fight for yourself? He looked at her then, his eyes full of something raw and broken. Because every time I do, someone I care about ends up getting hurt. First Clara, then Lucy. And now you. Evelyn's breath caught. You think pushing me away will save me? It'll just leave us both lonely again. Caleb turned from her, voice low. Better lonely than cursed. She wanted to reach for him, to shake sense into him, but she saw the grief in his face, the kind that carved scars too deep for reason to heal. So she did the hardest thing she'd done since her husband's death. She walked away. By morning, her things were gone. She'd taken the wagon into town, leaving only a note on the table. You promised me a miracle. Caleb, maybe this is where you learn what that really means. Caleb stood in the doorway, reading it again and again as the wind tugged at the paper. The ranch felt hollow, emptier than before she came. And for the first time in years, he dropped to his knees, his hat falling to the dirt, and whispered a prayer he wasn't sure anyone was listening to. Please, don't take her too. The wide sky offered no answer, only silence and the sting of his own regret. The days after Evelyn left felt longer than the plains themselves. The house was too quiet, the coffee pot too large for one man. Caleb moved through his routines like a ghost, feeding the horses, fixing the barn door, patching the roof. But nothing filled the space she'd left behind. He'd never realized how her presence had become part of everything. The way she hummed softly when she worked, the way her laughter made the walls less hollow. Without her, the ranch felt like it was fading back into the emptiness it had known. Before she came, Caleb didn't ride into town to look for her. Pride stopped him at first, then guilt, then fear, the kind of fear that came from knowing you'd broken something you couldn't fix with your hands. He told himself she was better off without him, safer. But late at night, when the wind howled through the eaves, he'd whisper her name and wonder if she was thinking of him too. Then, one evening, the storm returned. It came rolling over the horizon like vengeance itself, black clouds twisting above the ridge, lightning cracking the sky wide open. Caleb felt it in his bones. Something was wrong. He was in the barn when the first drops fell, heavy and cold. The horses stamped nervously, sensing danger. Caleb reached for Jasper's reins, trying to calm him, but his thoughts were far away in town with Evelyn. She hated storms. They reminded her of the night she'd lost her husband. As thunder boomed, he dropped everything and saddled up. He didn't think, didn't plan, he just rode. The rain hit hard, soaking him through as Jasper pounded down the muddy trail toward Redemption Ridge. When he reached town, the streets were nearly empty. The saloon windows glowed faintly through the downpour, but most folks had taken shelter. He spotted Henry, the old wagon driver who'd first brought Evelyn west, struggling to tie down his horses outside the blacksmith's. "Henry!" Caleb shouted over the rain. "You seen Mrs. Ross?" Henry's eyes widened. "She ain't at your place?" Caleb's heart dropped. "No. Thought she was staying in town." Henry shook his head. "She left this morning. Said she was headed east something about visiting a friend near Willow Creek, but that road's near washed out." Caleb didn't wait to hear more. He turned Jasper and rode hard, the rain blinding his eyes, the wind tearing at his coat. The creek road was steep and narrow, cutting through a ravine that turned to a river when the rains came. He pushed forward anyway, shouting Evelyn's name into the storm. After what felt like hours, he spotted a broken wagon at the bend of the trail, its wheel shattered, its canvas ripped to ribbons. His heart stopped. "Evelyn!" A faint cry answered him, a soft, desperate sound. He leapt from Jasper and ran toward it. There, under the wrecked wagon, sat Evelyn, her hair plastered to her face, clutching a bundle close to her chest. When she saw him, her eyes widened not in surprise, but in relief. "Caleb!" Her voice broke. "I found him, this baby. He was alone by the road. Someone left him to die." He stared at her, rain dripping from his hat brim. The bundle squirmed, a tiny, crying infant wrapped in a soaked blanket. Evelyn shielded it with her body, trembling but determined. "I couldn't leave him," she whispered. "He needs us." Caleb knelt beside her, the thunder rumbling like the heartbeat of the earth itself. He took off his coat and wrapped it around them both. "You did right," he said hoarsely. "You did real right." She looked up at him through tears and rain. "Do you see, Caleb? This is the miracle you promised me." The words struck through him like lightning, not the kind that burned, but the kind that illuminated everything. He gathered her and the baby into his arms and carried them toward Jasper Dodd as he lifted them into the saddle. The storm began to ease, the clouds breaking just enough to reveal a single streak of silver moonlight, and for the first time in years, Caleb Ward-broken, stubborn, faithless, found himself praying, not out of desperation but gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered into the wind, "for bringing her back, for bringing them." The miracle he'd promised had come, though not in the way either of them expected. It wasn't just a child saved from the storm, it was love, reborn in the wreckage of two shattered hearts. The storm broke before dawn, leaving the world soaked and trembling under a pale gray sky. Caleb's ranch stood quiet, steam rising from the damp earth. Inside, the fire he'd kindled crackled faintly, chasing away the chill that clung to Evelyn's clothes and the infant's fragile skin. Evelyn sat wrapped in a blanket by the hearth, the rescued baby swaddled in her arms. He was small, no more than a few weeks old, with tufts of dark hair and a soft cry that filled the cabin like music. She rocked him gently, her voice low and steady. "Hush now, little one. You're safe. You're home." Caleb stood nearby, watching her. His shirt was still damp, his hands scraped from hauling the broken wagon off the road. But the exhaustion didn't touch the strange warmth growing in his chest as he looked at them. Evelyn and that tiny life, two pieces of the miracle he hadn't known he was waiting for, found him all alone. She whispered, eyes shining with tears. "Who could do such a thing?" Caleb knelt beside her, gaze fixed on the child. "World's full of folks who lose hope," he said quietly. "Guess that's why we gotta keep finding it again." She looked up at him then, really looked, and something in her expression softened. "You sound like a man who's found his own." He didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the firelight dancing across her face. "Maybe I have." For a while, neither spoke. The baby had fallen asleep, his tiny fist curled against her chest. Evelyn leaned her head back against the chair, weary but peaceful. Caleb rose and draped another blanket over her shoulders, careful not to wake the child. His hand brushed her hair, and he felt a jolt of something he hadn't dared feel in years' tenderness. Deep and aching. She stirred slightly. "You should rest too," she murmured. He gave a faint smile. "Ain't tired." But he was lying. He was exhausted not from the storm, but from the war inside him. All his life he'd built walls to keep people out, believing it was the only way to survive. Yet here she was, sitting by his fire with a child in her arms, and somehow those walls were gone. When the sun finally rose, a thin beam of gold crept across the cabin floor. The light touched the baby first, then Evelyn, then Caleb. She opened her eyes and saw him watching her. "He needs a name," she said softly. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. "How about Luke?" "Means light, don't it?" Her lips curved in a small, trembling smile. "It does, Luke." She looked down at the baby. Little Luke Ward. Caleb froze. "Ward?" She blushed faintly. "Well, he ought to belong somewhere. And if this ranch is home to you—" Her voice trailed off uncertain. He swallowed hard. "It's home to both of you, if you'll have it." For a long heartbeat, the only sound was the fire. Evelyn looked up at him, tears filling her eyes again, tears of something brighter than sorrow. "You mean that?" He nodded slowly. "You and that boy, you brought life back to this place. Back to me. I ain't letting that go." A silence followed, full and warm, as if the house itself was breathing easier. Evelyn reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. Their fingers fit together like they'd been waiting a lifetime for that touch. Later that day, Caleb rode into town to fetch the doctor and supplies. The townsfolk watched him curiously as he led the doctor toward the wagon trail, word spreading quick about the baby found in the storm. But for the first time, Caleb didn't care what they said. He rode home to his family. He let the word settle in his heart like a seed taking root. That night, as the fire burned low and Evelyn hummed softly to Luke, Caleb sat beside them, feeling something he'd thought forever lost. Peace, love, and faith, not in heaven's promise, but in the quiet, ordinary miracle that had found its way to his door. By spring, Redemption Ridge was blooming again. The hills that once lay cracked and brown now shimmered with green, and the air smelled of wildflowers and rain. Life had returned, not just to the land, but to the people who called it home. Caleb Ward's ranch, once a place of silence and ghosts, had become something different. Something alive. Word had spread through town about the baby they'd found, the miracle child, folks called him. At first, gossip circled like vultures, as it always did. Some whispered that Evelyn had brought trouble with her, others said she'd brought Caleb back from the dead. But in time, the harsh tongues grew quiet. It was hard to speak ill of kindness when everyone could see it so clearly. Evelyn's warmth had reached even the coldest hearts. She baked bread for the townsfolk, tended the sick, and spoke gently of hope in a way that made people want to believe again. And Caleb, though still quiet, seemed lighter. He walked through town with his shoulders straighter, his eyes softer. He no longer looked like a man half buried by the past. One crisp morning, the sheriff rode up the ridge, a folded document tucked beneath his arm. Caleb met him on the porch, wary but calm. "Morning, Ward," Sheriff Donnelly said, tipping his hat. "Got something that belongs to you." Caleb frowned, taking the paper. "What's this?" "Proof you're clear," the sheriff said with a smile. "Turns out those branded cattle belonged to a trader passing through. Earl Tompkins was barking up the wrong tree." Caleb let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Appreciate it, Sheriff." "Don't thank me," Donnelly said, mounting his horse. "Thank that woman of yours. She marched into my office and wouldn't leave till we double-checked the ledgers. Told me she wouldn't stand by while a good man's name got dragged through the mud." Caleb watched him ride off, his heart swelling with something fierce and tender. Evelyn had stood for him when he hadn't the strength to stand for himself. He went inside, finding her in the kitchen, humming softly as she mashed vegetables for little Luke's supper. The sunlight fell across her face, and for a moment he just stood there, memorizing the scene, the peace, the laughter in her eyes, the life in her touch. "Sheriff dropped by," he said finally. "Said you gave him quite an earful." Evelyn looked up, cheeks pink. "Did he now?" He nodded. "He also said my name's cleared." She smiled, setting the spoon aside. "Good. I told you the truth would rise same as spring." Caleb stepped closer, his gaze soft. "You always believe that?" "Always," she said. "Even when it hurts?" There was a quiet between them, warm, thick, filled with everything they hadn't said yet. Caleb reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You ever think maybe you're the miracle I promised?" Her breath caught. "Caleb," he shook his head gently. "No, listen. You came here when I was just a man holding on to a memory. You gave this place life again. You gave me life again. I don't rightly know how to thank you for that." She blinked back tears. "You already have. Every time you choose to live instead of mourn, you thank me." He took her hand and pressed it against his heart. "Then I'll keep thanking you till my last breath." That evening, as the sun bled orange over the fields, they walked out to the old oak tree where Caleb had once buried his grief. Together they planted a new sapling, a small apple tree. "For Luke," Evelyn said, smiling softly. "So he'll always know where his roots began." Caleb looked at her, sunlight glinting off the tears in her eyes, and realized that love had done what time could not. It had healed what was broken. The land, once scarred, now bloomed under their care. The ranch that had been a tomb was now a home, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb Ward understood that redemption didn't come from forgetting the past. It came from learning to live again despite it. Summer came to redemption, ridge like a blessing. The sky stretched wide and endless, the kind of blue that made a man believe in heaven again. The fields shimmered under the sunlight, the horses ran strong and proud, and laughter drifted from the old ranch house, the kind of sound that once seemed impossible in that lonely stretch of land. Inside, Evelyn Ross, no longer the wandering widow but the heart of the ranch, rocked little Luke Ward near the window, humming a soft tune. The boy was growing fast, bright-eyed and strong, reaching for the sunlight as if he knew he'd been born out of a miracle. His tiny hands grasped her fingers, his giggle spilling like music through the house. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching them. He'd seen a lot in his life, storms, loss, death, but nothing as beautiful as that sight. A woman who'd once been broken by grief, now whole again. A child who'd come from nowhere, now loved beyond measure. And himself a man who'd stopped believing, standing in the center of it all, grateful, humbled, redeemed. He smiled faintly. "That boy's going to be ridden before he's walking, mark my words." Evelyn laughed softly without looking up. "Not if I have any say in it. He's going to keep both feet on the ground till he's old enough to know better." Caleb stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You forget you married a cowboy. He's bound to follow his old man's ways." She tilted her head, smiling up at him. "Married, are we?" He chuckled, his sound deep and warm. "Soon enough, if you'll have me." Her breath caught. "Caleb." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in both of his. His voice was low, steady, but full of feeling. "Evelyn, I spent half my life fighting ghosts, running from the hurt I couldn't name. Then you showed up in a storm and turned all that to light. You and that boy, you're my second chance. My miracle. I don't want another day to pass without calling you mine." Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was soft and sure. "You already are, Caleb Ward. You have been since the night you carried me out of the rain." He kissed her then, gentle, certain like a man reclaiming not just love, but life itself. The kiss carried the weight of everything they'd lost and everything they'd found again. Weeks later, the whole town gathered beneath the sprawling oak by the ridge for their wedding. The sky was painted with gold, the wind light and warm. The sheriff stood grinning beside them as they exchanged vows, while the townsfolk, once skeptical, now smiled openly. Even Earl Tompkins tipped his hat with grudging respect. Evelyn wore a simple white dress, her hair loose and glowing in the sunlight. Caleb looked every bit the man he was meant to be, steady, strong, eyes full of peace. When the sheriff pronounced them man and wife, the crowd erupted in cheers, and little Luke clapped his tiny hands as though he understood what joy was. That night, after the guests had gone and the stars hung thick above them, Caleb and Evelyn sat together on the porch. The baby slept between them, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the prairie breeze. Caleb broke the silence first. "Funny thing," he said. "All that time I thought miracles were something the heavens sent down when you prayed hard enough." Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder. "And now?" He looked out over the moonlit land, the fields he'd once thought cursed. "Now I think maybe they're the quiet things, the ones you build with your own hands. The ones that sneak up on you when you finally stop running." She smiled. "Like love." He nodded. "Exactly like love." The wind swept gently through the tall grass, carrying the scent of wild sage and the soft cry of a nightbird. Caleb wrapped an arm around her, drawing her close, the peace of the world settling around them. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel haunted. He didn't feel lost. The lonely cowboy who once promised a miracle had found two, one in the woman who taught him to hope again, and one in the child who made that hope real. And as dawn began to break across Redemption Ridge, Caleb Ward finally understood that love wasn't something that came like thunder or lightning. It came softly, like morning light, quiet but everlasting.